So, physical culture, some of you might at some point go to my actual YouTube sort of page, and you'll see I have all these playlists, and most of them are not my videos. It was just stuff that I thought was interesting, and I categorized it because I was like, whoa, at some point I might want to just see this again. So now and then it'll pop up in my own feed, and I'm like, oh, what's this? 3 years ago. And it's like, oh yeah, this is in this playlist. And I was like, oh, cool. Yeah, I obviously wanted to probably watch this again at some point. So I was thinking about this because of an explosion now in extremely rare physical culture video posts coming out of China, that martial art forms that, you might have heard of if you looked at like Tiger Claw magazine or Black Belt or things like that. You would now and then, there would be like an interview with somebody who does this, but there's a lot of martial arts that, because they're people that only have so many hours in the day, they don't have time necessarily to learn English. So my teacher would talk about this. He goes, no, I get you don't understand. There's more styles than you could ever imagine. And he's like, and they change. And he's like, they say they don't change, and they change, and they merge, and they diverge, and things like that. And he said, like, styles that will have, say 100 some forms in them. He's like, it's very likely those came from multiple martial artists joining some school and bringing those forms into that school. And then you just get more and more and more. Because somebody would, they were very proficient in the style of that school, but they did something that came from another style. And they thought it would be good to do that as a method of training as well. And also, he goes, and to keep people busy. He said, when people who are like martial arts instructors, especially in something like the Chinese tradition, there's so many forms and so many weapons that it really is a matter of that a lot of times people just hitch their donkey to a school and are there for decades. Their kids are there, and it's just the way that it shows through how it's structured. That's very likely the way it's always, like this idea of going style to style to style and then doing MMA and competition. Not really the way the Chinese did it up until relatively recently, in dealing with international competitions with Westerners and stuff like that. With Jet Li even introducing in Fist of Legend, which was an homage to Fist of Fury, this idea of combining various types of methods, to the point where he's having a fight with his own Sifu because he's brought things in from the outside, and it's understood, like, you're not supposed to bring these things in from the outside. When you fight our style, you fight our style. And he was fighting to win, and it was the idea of out of vengeance, that he was going to use what he knew, and it would win. And so, yeah, okay. So, because Fist of Legend also was such a huge influence on American physical culture from 1990s on, I got to see it in the in the late 1990s. A few years after that, Pavel Tsatsouline introduces Enter the Kettlebell, if I remember right, or the Russian Kettlebell Challenge. That was the book, the Russian Kettlebell Challenge, and with the idea being that he was going to see if there were people who could get to the point where they could actually do Giriavoy sport, which the standard for men is a 72-pound kettlebell. And so, the thing that ends up becoming fascinating about it is because the idea is that they even call it a strength endurance. That what you're doing is this long grind of something that takes a relatively high level of strength. Can you mentally be efficient enough that you get the technique down fine enough that you don't lose a lot of energy? That's the challenge of Giryavoy sport. And that's then you get CrossFit from that. Pavel Tsatsouline does the CrossFit kettlebell, or he does the kettlebell seminar. The CrossFit guys are there, and Scott Sonnen's there. And I think that's 1994, if I remember, was when that happened, or 97 is when supposedly that happened. That's the famous meeting of Scott Sonnen and Pavel Tsatsouline, and they were these guys introducing the idea of Russian boxing and Russian martial arts into America, or their concepts, and they had heard of each other. And with the famous thing of Pavel Tsatsouline being that the Spetsnaz techniques he was taught were this ability to take tremendous amounts of powerful force against you, while Sonnen's method that he was taught was to actually to be extremely elastic when you're struck, so the energy transfers heavily it transfers through the body. It doesn't stick any place. And they both are like, wow. And Pavel Tsatsouline marks it down to, no, Spetsnaz teaches a lot of things, and many of us didn't really know about other groups. That they have their own secrets, and it was kind of funny. It was like that idea that the little introduction to the concept of the culture of Russian, what Russian deep state thinking in that part of the culture ends up looking like. So you see, and then Pavel Tsatsouline introduced a lot of concepts from Russian culture. A lot of what it was like. Just thoughts, ideas. Remember, he'd be sending out emails. This also gets a lot of different people these are guys like, especially somebody like Scott Sonnen. Scott Sonnen was the story of recovery from a very rough childhood, and having an illness that he should have never been a competitive martial artist. He should have never been a fitness trainer. But what he learned, he repaired his body in a way. He was and it was, his thing was Slavic dancing. He had his introduction to martial arts was through Slavic dance, and by doing that, his body became more and more resilient, and eventually he was able to start training in various forms of wrestling. And that's what kind of his world is wrestling and fitness for various tactical types of things and stuff, and also adapting training methods, because so he's one of the people who has introduced some of the most there's a thing called Z Health that came from the work of Scott Sonnen and another guy. And that's like a relatively well understood therapeutic exercise method. There's some people who might say it's hocus pocus or this, that, and the other. But I mean, I know the systems that it was derived from. I'm like, no, this totally makes sense. It's so physical culture has become key to therapy. Physical therapy. Physical therapists had ridiculous exercises when I was in the scene. They would do things that it's like, technically that muscle does that. Technically, this action is what you're trying to quote unquote facilitate in a way. But what I started to find was that a lot of the exercises physical therapists would give people, I'm like, well, but you don't actually move like that. So I was a part of this new understanding of physical therapy by comparing it to, if you were given a framework in an East Asian martial art of how to train a movement, ... So physical therapy and all of this all changed. It all had this massive change that happened within living memory. And it was glorious. Guys who were as awkward as hell becoming amazing athletes. But of their choice, like what they wanted to do. Like yeah. And all it took was understanding how the mind works with the musculature and skeletal system to get certain kind of kinks out of the way a person moves. Then that starts getting their energy up because they're moving a lot more. And then the rest of it kicks in on its own, which is kind of miraculous. That humans are built to be motile. Most humans we like dancing. It makes you naturally happy. It makes the ends of your mouth rise toward the ends of your eyes, and naturally. That's a big deal. Scott Sonnen was one of the people who got into this idea, as opposed to some degree, as opposed to Pavel Tsatsouline's methods that would have a tremendous amount of focused intensity. He actually even notes that Americans that he trained when these methods were meant to be used in their flexibility stage, he was like, Americans don't seem to adapt to this very well. Sonnen had a different approach, and his method actually had a more kind of a different success rate. And the reason why was, it was like, while high tension techniques of weightlifting did do a lot of good for people who were totally unfamiliar, and that you get that out of CrossFit. You see the results through that part of the culture. But the relaxation trainings, that's something you just don't see these people. When you see these people, you're like, wow, that person moves really smoothly, this, that, and the other. And it's because that these were methods of making a person sort of lower the tonus of the musculature. And that's its own kind of mental skill. And in Chinese martial arts, this is something that's incredibly difficult to get across to people, unless there's some kind of exercise, typically, that is a movement exercise that makes you, okay, now you see you're still too tense to do that. You have to relax this section of your body to make it move like this. Then this is a really big deal. Like, this is what actually has held back the development and spread of a lot of Chinese martial arts and East Asian martial art methodologies, is because there's a degree to which Americans just simply seem to be wired different. Russians are wired different. Americans are wired different. And so a lot of people in psychology, when dealing with like this idea of men and toxic masculinity and the problems of lonely men and blah, 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 they're really not getting like, so as compared to what? Were the guys who did CrossFit, were they toxic? Because I guarantee you, almost anybody who's like one of these writers in the field of psychology and stuff, they probably went to CrossFit so as to meet some of the hunks. It was probably they probably did a little bit of CrossFit, or they had friends who did, or something along those lines. So there's just a lot of this that it's like, okay, so we're the 90s guys Were men in the 90s, when there was still plenty of dancing and physical culture, were they toxic and lonely? Who are you comparing this to? And so they would compare it now to kind of like soft, round boys who are obviously in bad health, who probably, don't get a lot of physical activity, but they're very, very, very non-threatening to women. Now, also, this starts to bring up some questions, too. Men who are fit, men who have gone through some kind of... There's a way men walk. There's actually even a certain level of testosterone will have an actual smell you could pick up on. Mothers pick this up on their sons at a certain point, that they're like, wow, why do you smell so bad all the time now? And so they're actually starting to smell what comes from a high levels of testosterone. Where there will be, like, say, that stage at which a pair of lovers, a woman loves smelling something that a man wears, like one of his items of clothing. She's actually smelling the testosterone and his scent. We see this with lots of animals, and the way that you can, like, set up a bed for your animal is that you put something of yours that you would have worn in the bed, and so they're comforted because your scent is there. So it's now the psychological part. My teacher was really big on introducing Chinese medicine and aspects of Chinese culture and literacy, mostly through, like, encouraging us to read a variety of different, categories of text. I got totally into it. So I have this small library on Taoism, various Mahayana, Chan, and Chan Buddhism books. Then I have, like, this whole awesome little set of books from Vajrayana Buddhism, because I just got really, really, really interested in the whole thing when I got into martial arts. It was like, I really want to know what this all has to do with, like, what's the cultural milieu this came from. And at a certain point, you have to make a decision. You have to learn a foreign language to learn a foreign art. And I was like, I'm a little too old for that. I'm a little, because I started training in martial arts as a full-grown adult, and so, and I just didn't have the money either anymore or anything like that. And I was like, no, I'm going to have to start doing something. So I started to try to go into various forms of therapeutic exercise and massage therapy and stuff like that, alternative medicine. So I met mostly men. I was super hippy-dippy, but it was still, it's a boys' club for the most part, because it's mostly a descendant of Iron Age and early Steel Age agrarian lifestyles, coming from a part of the world that clans learned their tribal martial art, and that they would defend their region using that art and would enforce, like, the laws of the area and stuff like that. And I always, there was a part of my mind that I'm like, no, it's not like, so it's not antiquated, it's ancient. But then I realized, no, there's an aspect of it that it's the alternative lifestyle stuff. It comes from an antiquated thing for certain groups of people's mindset. They want the modern world, ancient wisdom, but the cultures cannot mix. I didn't understand modern culture and what modernism was. So I didn't get that yet. And I thought everybody would be doing kung fu and karate all the time, everywhere. And now, yes, a lot of people are. And yet, you are seeing now, for especially a lot of men, now that we're having to realize, no, a life that pretty much was pre-electrical is normal for most humans. But modern stuff, not really that normal. Modern life isn't normal. And then you see, we have then the modern women. What no man wants. But don't worry, they were there at the yoga / kung fu club way back in the 2000s. But now there's not much to it. And I've also watched a lot of these guys who are martial arts guys and stuff. They would be in some relationship, or they would be married, have multiple children, and a lot of times they would marry some pretty hot women or have kids with pretty hot women. And that had its own problem in the long run, because of course they were modern and they didn't want like anything like a normal functional family, that if they had to really sacrifice to do it, because they weren't really accepting that their significant other was an artist, and that artists don't really make a very good living until they're teaching. That, or they're a competitive fighter, and competitive fighters, that's its own hard life. And yeah, that's its own hard life. So even most martial arts instructors actually have typically a hard job on the side. They're usually not accountants. They're usually, they're usually something like a contractor or something like that. Very, electrician, things like that. And it's a tough life. It's like being a boxing coach. It's not glorious. It seems glamorous, but it's you do have to tame your appetites and train your mind. Yeah, it's just some thoughts I'm having.